Sometimes the person who keeps looking at you is not trying to make you uncomfortable. Sometimes they are trying to find the courage to change both of your lives. The wedding chapel fell completely silent as the bride and groom reached for each other's hands beneath an arch covered with white roses and soft greenery. Warm afternoon sunlight poured through the tall windows, painting golden patterns across the polished wooden floor, while every guest smiled toward the couple standing at the altar. Every guest except one. I noticed him almost by accident. The best man stood beside the groom in a perfectly tailored navy suit, calm and composed. Yet instead of watching the ceremony unfold in front of him, his eyes kept drifting toward me. The first time it happened, I assumed I had imagined it. The second time, I looked away before he could notice that I had caught him. The third time, there was no denying it anymore. Every time applause filled the chapel or everyone turned toward the bride and groom, his attention somehow found its way back to me. I had never seen him before in my life, and yet there was something strangely familiar about the quiet kindness in his expression. It was not an uncomfortable stare. It was almost as though he had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment. I tried to focus on the ceremony, but curiosity quietly settled into my thoughts. When the newly married couple exchanged rings, everyone stood to celebrate. I clapped with the rest of the guests, and for one brief second our eyes met again across the chapel. He smiled first. It was small, almost hesitant, but sincere enough to make my heart beat just a little faster. I smiled back without even realizing I had done it. 3 days earlier, I had been standing in my apartment in Portland debating whether I should even attend the wedding at all. My cousin Emma had called weeks before, insisting that I could not possibly miss one of the biggest days of her life. I promised I would be there, even though weddings had never been my favorite events. Too many strangers, too many conversations beginning with questions about work, relationships, and future plans. I preferred quiet, bookstores, weekend coffee shops, and evenings spent reading at home. My older sister laughed when I admitted I was nervous. "You are going to support Emma," she reminded me. "Not audition for everyone's approval." She was right, of course. By Friday afternoon, I had packed a small overnight bag and driven 3 hours to the vineyard where the ceremony would take place. The venue looked like something from a postcard. Endless rows of grapevines stretched across gentle hills, white flowers decorated every pathway, and strings of warm lights hung between old oak trees waiting for the evening reception. Family members hurried from one place to another carrying flower arrangements, gift boxes, and seating charts while cheerful music drifted through the open gardens. I checked into the small guest cottage before offering to help wherever I was needed. That was how I first noticed the man everyone kept calling Nathan. He moved calmly through every unexpected problem with quiet confidence, helping vendors unload equipment, greeting arriving relatives with genuine warmth, adjusting schedules without ever raising his voice, and somehow making every stressful moment look effortless. Several people thanked him for keeping the wedding organized, and Emma whispered with a grateful smile that she could not imagine the weekend without her fiancé's lifelong best friend handling everything. Nathan only laughed and insisted that making sure the day went smoothly was the easiest promise he had ever kept. At the time, he barely glanced in my direction, and I thought nothing of it. If someone had told me then that only 3 days later I would be standing inside the chapel wondering why the best man could not seem to stop looking at me, I would have smiled politely and said they must have mistaken me for someone far more interesting. The wedding ceremony ended beneath a chorus of applause as the newly married couple walked back down the aisle surrounded by smiling family members and close friends. Guests slowly made their way outside toward the vineyard gardens where the cocktail reception had already begun. Soft acoustic music floated through the warm afternoon air while servers carried trays of sparkling drinks and elegant appetizers across the stone pathways. I stepped away from the crowd for a moment, hoping to enjoy a few quiet minutes before the evening celebration became even livelier. Unfortunately, my peaceful escape lasted less than 30 seconds. "There you are," my cousin Emma called with a bright smile as she hurried toward me, still glowing with happiness after the ceremony. "I need one more favor." I laughed. "You have already collected about 20 favors from me this weekend. Then one more will not hurt." Before I had the chance to ask what she meant, She gently guided me toward a nearby table where seating charts and guest welcome bags had somehow become mixed together after a delivery delay. Standing beside the table, calmly sorting everything into perfect order, was Nathan. He looked up as we approached, and for the briefest moment that same quiet smile returned to his face. "Nathan has been rescuing us all weekend," Emma said. "I figured the two most organized people here should work together." I almost protested that she had clearly overestimated my organizational skills, but she disappeared before I could say anything else. Nathan chuckled softly. "I have learned that arguing with the bride is never a winning strategy." His easy confidence made me laugh. "That might be the smartest thing I have heard all day." We spent the next hour arranging welcome gifts, checking guest names, and carrying small decorative items from one reception table to another. The work itself was simple, yet conversation came surprisingly naturally. Nathan never dominated the discussion. Instead, he listened carefully before speaking, asking thoughtful questions that made even ordinary topics feel interesting. He learned that I worked as a graphic designer in Portland creating illustrations for children's educational materials. I learned that he managed architectural projects in Seattle and had known the groom since elementary school. He once convinced me to build a treehouse that collapsed before we even finished painting it. Nathan admitted with an amused smile. "We considered it a successful learning experience." "That sounds like something cousins in my family would have done," I replied. As the afternoon continued, unexpected little moments kept bringing us together. When a strong breeze scattered place cards across the lawn, we chased them together while laughing at how quickly carefully arranged plans could disappear. When one of the older relatives struggled to carry a heavy flower arrangement, Nathan reached it first, but he waited for me so we could lift it together rather than trying to do everything himself. During a short break, we stood beneath the shade of an old oak tree overlooking the vineyard, sipping iced lemonade while watching guests arrive from nearby hotels. The silence between us felt comfortable instead of awkward. "You seem surprisingly calm for someone responsible for half this wedding," I said. Nathan looked across the gardens before answering. "The secret is accepting that something unexpected always happens. Once you stop fighting that, everything becomes easier." I smiled because the advice sounded as though it applied to far more than weddings. Just then, the wedding photographer called for immediate family and close friends to gather for rehearsal photographs before sunset. Nathan excused himself with an apologetic smile, promising he would return after helping organize the next part of the schedule. As he walked away, I caught myself watching him for a second longer than I probably should have. It was only then that I realized something quietly unsettling. I had spent the entire afternoon wondering why he seemed so interested in noticing me, yet without realizing it, I had slowly begun looking for him every time I entered a new room. By the time the sun began slipping toward the horizon, the entire vineyard seemed to glow beneath strings of warm lights hanging between rows of old oak trees. The reception area had transformed into a welcoming celebration filled with quiet laughter, gentle music, and the comforting sound of families reconnecting after years apart. Long wooden tables were decorated with white flowers, candles flickered inside glass lanterns, and the scent of fresh bread and grilled vegetables drifted through the evening air. I found my assigned seat near several cousins I had not seen in years, but every now and then my attention wandered toward the head table where Nathan continued making sure everything unfolded exactly as planned. He never appeared rushed, even though people constantly stopped him with questions. He answered each one with the same patient smile, somehow making every guest feel important. During dinner, my aunt leaned closer with an amused expression. "You and the best man seem to have become friends very quickly." I nearly laughed into my glass of sparkling water. "We spent part of the afternoon organizing welcome bags. That hardly makes us friends." She smiled knowingly. "Maybe not, but I noticed he keeps looking this way." Before I could answer, another cousin joined the conversation. "I noticed that too," she said with a playful grin. "Every time someone starts talking to him, he somehow ends up glancing toward this table." I immediately looked away, hoping they would stop teasing me before my face turned noticeably warm. I told myself they were simply imagining things because weddings always encouraged people to invent little romantic stories. Still, curiosity quietly settled into the back of my mind once again. Later that evening, the wedding planner announced a short rehearsal for family members who would participate in a special anniversary toast for the bride and groom. Since Emma had unexpectedly asked me to help distribute keepsake candles afterward, I found myself standing beside Nathan, once more near the edge of the dance floor. We worked side by side, handing small boxes to guests as they entered the garden terrace. "I think we have become the unofficial logistics team," I joked. Nathan laughed softly. I was thinking exactly the same thing. There was something unusually comfortable about talking with him. Conversations never felt forced. We could spend several minutes discussing architecture, favorite bookstores, or travel destinations, then fall into an easy silence without either of us feeling obligated to fill it. As twilight settled over the vineyard, the newly married couple shared their first dance, while everyone gathered around the wooden dance floor. Soft lights reflected across the nearby pond, creating a peaceful atmosphere that almost felt unreal. I happened to glance toward Nathan at the exact moment he looked toward me again. This time, neither of us looked away immediately. Instead, he offered another quiet smile before returning his attention to the bride and groom. My heartbeat quickened for reasons I could not fully explain. A little later, the photographer invited guests to spread throughout the gardens for candid evening photographs. I wandered toward a quiet stone pathway lined with flowering vines, hoping for a brief escape from the cheerful crowd. A few moments later, I heard familiar footsteps approaching. Nathan stopped beside me, leaving a respectful distance between us as we admired the rows of grapevines stretching beneath the fading sky. "Beautiful evening," he said. "It really is," I replied. We stood there watching tiny lights begin to glow among the trees until he spoke again. "Can I ask you something?" I turned toward him with quiet curiosity. "Of course." He hesitated for only a second before asking, "Have you ever walked into a place and felt certain you had seen someone before, even if you could not explain why?" The question caught me completely by surprise. I searched my memory, studying his calm expression beneath the soft evening lights, but no answer came. All I could do was gently shake my head, unaware that his simple question had quietly opened the door to a truth that would soon change everything I believed about our first meeting. A gentle breeze swept across the vineyard just as the last traces of daylight disappeared behind the rolling hills, and within minutes the carefully planned outdoor reception faced its first unexpected challenge. Dark clouds gathered overhead much faster than anyone had predicted, followed by a light drizzle that sent guests hurrying beneath covered terraces, while the wedding planner calmly announced a short delay before the evening festivities could continue. Nobody seemed truly upset. Instead, relatives laughed as they carried centerpieces indoors, musicians carefully protected their instruments, and volunteers quickly rearranged tables inside the elegant reception hall. I immediately joined several cousins moving candles and flower arrangements away from the rain. Before long, I found myself working beside Nathan again. "I guess your theory about expecting the unexpected was right," I said as we carried a large floral display through the open doors. He smiled with quiet satisfaction. "Every wedding has one surprise. This one just happens to involve the weather." For the next 2 hours, we worked together almost constantly. We moved chairs, adjusted table settings, helped the catering staff reorganize serving stations, and hung decorative lights inside the ballroom so the celebration would still feel warm and welcoming despite the sudden change of plans. It should have been exhausting, yet somehow the work became enjoyable because every task gave us another opportunity to talk. Nathan told me about designing community libraries because he believed beautiful public spaces encouraged people to slow down and connect with one another. I admitted that I loved illustrating educational materials because seeing children become excited about reading always reminded me that small acts of kindness could quietly shape someone's future. "That sounds exactly like something you would choose," Nathan said with a thoughtful smile. "What does that mean?" I asked. He looked slightly embarrassed before answering. "You pay attention to people in ways most others do not." His words caught me off guard because I had been thinking the same thing about him since we first met. By the time the rain stopped, the reception hall looked even more beautiful than the original outdoor arrangement. Hundreds of warm string lights reflected softly across polished wooden beams, while candles flickered along every table, creating an intimate atmosphere that guests immediately admired. Emma hugged Nathan the moment she saw the finished room. "You saved the evening," she said gratefully. He laughed and gently shook his head. "Everyone saved it together." Later, after dinner resumed, the bride and groom thanked every volunteer for helping preserve the celebration. Listening to the applause surrounding us, I glanced toward Nathan and noticed he seemed happiest whenever someone else received recognition instead of him. As the evening grew quieter, we stepped outside onto a covered stone terrace overlooking the rain-soaked vineyard. Tiny drops of water still clung to the grapevines while distant lights shimmered across the hills. The peaceful silence felt completely different from the busy conversations inside. Nathan rested his hands lightly against the wooden railing before speaking. "There is something I have wanted to tell you since the first afternoon you arrived." I turned toward him with quiet curiosity. "What is it?" He hesitated for a moment, almost as though choosing each word carefully. "I do not think this weekend is actually the first time we have met." I searched my memory once again but could only offer an apologetic smile. "I wish I remembered." Nathan nodded gently without disappointment. "I figured you probably would not." His calm acceptance somehow made the mystery even more intriguing. Before I could ask another question, music drifted through the open terrace doors as guests returned to the dance floor for the next celebration. Nathan smiled warmly before offering his arm with playful courtesy. "We should probably help make sure the bride gets the evening she deserves." I accepted the invitation with a quiet laugh, completely unaware that the story behind his impossible memory had been waiting for years to find its way back into both of our lives. The celebration continued long into the evening, and little by little the excitement of rescuing the reception from the unexpected rain settled into something quieter and more personal. The bride and groom shared dances with their families while guests laughed beneath the warm glow of string lights that reflected softly against the wooden beams of the reception hall. I found myself smiling more often than I had expected all weekend, though I still could not stop thinking about Nathan's mysterious comment that we had met before. Every time I looked in his direction, he seemed completely relaxed, chatting with relatives, helping the musicians, or making sure every guest had exactly what they needed. Yet every so often our eyes met again, and the same quiet familiarity returned. Later in the evening, the music softened as many guests stepped outside to enjoy the cool night air after dinner. Nathan approached with 2 cups of hot coffee and offered one to me with an easy smile. "I thought you might need this after such a long day." I accepted it gratefully. "You somehow remember everything." He laughed softly. "Not everything, just the things that matter." We wandered together along a stone pathway leading through the vineyard where the rain had left tiny drops of water shimmering across every vine beneath the moonlight. The sounds of the reception faded behind us until only distant music and quiet conversation floated through the evening air. For several peaceful moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I looked toward him. "Earlier you said we had already met before this weekend." Nathan nodded slowly. "We did." I waited patiently, sensing he had carried the story for a long time. "About 4 years ago," he began, "I was visiting a small independent bookstore in Portland while waiting for a client meeting. It was raining that afternoon. I remember because everyone who came inside looked frustrated except one person." I frowned slightly, trying to remember. Nathan continued with a gentle smile. "You were standing near the children's section helping a little girl choose her first chapter book. She looked nervous because she thought the book was too difficult, and you spent nearly 20 minutes encouraging her until she believed she could read it. You never realized anyone was watching." My eyes widened in surprise as the memory slowly returned. "I remember the little girl," I whispered. "Her father thanked me before they left." Nathan nodded. "I was sitting at the cafe corner inside the bookstore. I watched the entire conversation." I laughed quietly in disbelief. "You remembered all of that?" "I remembered you," he answered honestly. "Most people hurry through ordinary moments without noticing them. You made that afternoon unforgettable simply by showing kindness to someone who needed encouragement." I looked down at my coffee, suddenly unsure what to say. "I never even saw you." "I know." There was no disappointment in his voice, only warmth. I told myself it was just a beautiful moment that belonged to a stranger. I thought I would probably never see you again. He paused before looking directly into my eyes. Then Emma called a few months ago and mentioned one of her cousins from Portland would be helping with the wedding. The moment she showed me a family photograph, I recognized you immediately. Suddenly, every glance during the ceremony, every quiet smile, and every thoughtful conversation made perfect sense. Nathan had not been looking at me because I was unfamiliar. He had been looking at someone whose memory had quietly stayed with him for years. My heart raced as I realized the weekend had never been an unexpected beginning for him. It had been the continuation of a story that I had never even known had already begun. The night gradually settled into a peaceful rhythm after our walk through the vineyard, and the reception became less about schedules and formal traditions and more about quiet conversations shared beneath glowing string lights. Guests gathered around small fire pits with cups of coffee and slices of wedding cake, while soft acoustic music drifted through the cool evening air. Nathan and I eventually returned to the celebration, but something between us had changed. The uncertainty that had filled our earlier conversations had quietly disappeared, replaced by an easy understanding that neither of us felt the need to explain. Every now and then someone stopped Nathan to thank him for helping create such a beautiful wedding, yet somehow he always found his way back beside me a few minutes later. "You have a habit of disappearing into thoughtful silence," he said with a gentle smile as we watched the bride and groom greeting relatives. I laughed softly. "I am still trying to process the fact that you remembered one afternoon from 4 years ago better than I did." Nathan looked toward the dance floor before answering. "It was never really about the afternoon. It was about how you made people feel." His words lingered in my thoughts long after the conversation moved on to lighter topics. We spent the next hour talking about ordinary parts of our lives that somehow felt important. He told me about restoring historic buildings because he believed old places deserved another chance instead of being forgotten. I admitted that my favorite days at work were never the busiest ones, but the quiet afternoons when a child discovered a book that made reading feel like an adventure instead of homework. The more we talked, the more I realized our conversations rarely centered on achievements or impressive stories. Instead, they naturally returned to kindness, family, and the simple moments people often overlooked. Near the end of the reception, Emma invited everyone outside for one final tradition before the evening concluded. Hundreds of tiny lanterns were placed along the stone pathway overlooking the vineyard, creating a warm ribbon of light stretching across the hills beneath a sky filled with stars. The bride thanked every guest for helping transform an unexpected rainy evening into one of the happiest memories of her life. As applause filled the quiet countryside, I happened to glance toward Nathan once again. This time, I finally understood why his eyes had kept finding mine throughout the ceremony. They were never searching for someone new. They were searching for confirmation that the person he had quietly remembered all those years was real. After the celebration officially ended, guests slowly began returning to the nearby cottages and hotels. Nathan and I remained behind with a few family members, helping fold chairs and carry the last decorations into storage. The work was simple, but neither of us seemed eager for the night to end. When the final table had been cleared, we walked together toward the parking area, where our cars were parked beneath the old oak trees, lining the entrance road. The vineyard had become almost completely silent except for crickets singing somewhere beyond the rows of vines. Nathan stopped beside his car but did not reach for the door. Instead, he looked at me with the same calm honesty that had defined every conversation we had shared since meeting. "Tomorrow everyone goes home," he said quietly. "The wedding will be over, and life will return to normal." I nodded, suddenly realizing how quickly the weekend had passed. "Yes." He smiled gently, though there was unmistakable hope behind his eyes. "I have been wondering whether normal has to mean goodbye." His question remained suspended in the peaceful night air, carrying more meaning than any grand declaration ever could. And as I stood there looking at the man who had quietly carried the memory of one small act of kindness for 4 years, I realized my answer mattered far more than I had been willing to admit even to myself. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet road leading away from the vineyard stretched beneath rows of old oak trees, their branches gently swaying in the cool night breeze while the last guests disappeared into the distance. I wanted to answer Nathan immediately, yet every honest response felt larger than the moment itself. I do not want this weekend to end with goodbye either, I admitted at last. I just do not know what happens after people return to different cities. Nathan nodded as though he had expected that concern. I have been asking myself the same question. His calm expression never changed, but I could see he was choosing every word carefully. Seattle and Portland are not next door, but they are not impossible either. I smiled faintly. That sounds like something an architect would say. He laughed softly. Probably. Just then his phone vibrated inside his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen and answered with a polite greeting. I stepped a few feet away, giving him privacy while pretending to admire the lanterns still glowing near the entrance gate. His conversation remained brief, but one sentence drifted clearly through the quiet night. Yes, I will be back in Chicago tomorrow morning if everything goes according to schedule. My heart tightened almost instantly. Chicago. I had spent the entire weekend believing Nathan lived and worked in Seattle. Before I could stop myself, countless explanations rushed through my mind. Perhaps Seattle had only been temporary. Perhaps he had accepted another position without mentioning it. Perhaps this entire weekend had simply been one beautiful interruption before he returned to a completely different life across the country. Nathan ended the call and walked back toward me with the same gentle smile as before. Sorry about that, he said. Work never seems to understand weekends. I forced a smile of my own, hoping he could not hear the disappointment quietly settling inside my voice. It sounds like you have a busy trip tomorrow. He looked slightly surprised but nodded. Something like that. I realized he had not actually explained anything, and suddenly I became afraid to ask. If Chicago truly was waiting for him, I was not sure I wanted to hear the answer spoken aloud. We stood together for another minute before I reached for my car keys. I should probably get some rest, I said. I have an early drive back to Portland. Nathan looked at me carefully, almost as though he sensed something had changed. Owen, is everything all right? I hesitated before answering. Yes, I am just tired. The words sounded unconvincing even to me. He seemed ready to ask another question, but I had already taken a small step backward. Thank you, I added quietly, for everything you did this weekend. His expression softened. I hope this is not the last conversation we have. My heart wanted to promise him it would not be. Instead, I simply smiled and wished him a safe trip before getting into my car. As I drove away from the vineyard, the warm lights of the wedding slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror. I kept replaying the phone call over and over, wondering why he had mentioned Chicago instead of Seattle and why he had not tried to explain it afterward. By the time I reached the highway, I had almost convinced myself that I had misunderstood everything between us. Some memories are beautiful precisely because they cannot last forever, and despite everything that had happened during the wedding weekend, I quietly began preparing myself to believe that perhaps Nathan had always been meant to become one of those memories. The drive back to Portland should have taken a little over 3 hours, but every mile seemed longer than the last because my thoughts refused to leave the vineyard behind. Nathan's smile, our conversations beneath the string lights, and the memory of him quietly admitting he had remembered me for 4 years replayed over and over until I could no longer separate reality from hope. By the time I reached my apartment that afternoon, I had almost convinced myself that I needed to let the weekend remain exactly what it had been. A beautiful chapter with a gentle ending. I unpacked my overnight bag, placed the small wedding favor Emma had given every guest on my bookshelf, and tried to settle back into ordinary life. Monday morning arrived with its familiar routine at the design studio. My coworkers chatted about deadlines while I reviewed new illustrations for an educational reading project, but even colorful sketches of storybook characters could not distract me for very long. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a message from Emma. Thank you again for everything. Everyone loved having you there. I smiled before replying that the wedding had been unforgettable. A second message arrived almost immediately. By the way, Nathan has been trying to reach you all morning. My heart skipped. I quickly checked my phone and realized it had automatically filtered 2 unknown numbers into voicemail because of a recent software update. I opened the first message. Nathan's calm voice filled the room. "Owen, I think there has been a misunderstanding. Please call me whenever you hear this." The second message sounded more concerned than the first. "I realized after you left that you overheard part of my phone call. I should have explained it immediately." Without hesitating, I called him back. He answered before the first ring had fully ended. "Thank you," he said with obvious relief. "I was beginning to think you did not want to hear from me." I closed my office door for privacy. "I thought you were leaving for Chicago." A brief silence followed before Nathan let out a soft, almost amused laugh. "Now I understand." He spoke gently, careful not to make me feel embarrassed. The call was about a 2-day business presentation. My company has a client in Chicago. I was never moving there. I leaned back against my chair and closed my eyes. "I thought you had accepted another position." "No," he replied. Immediately, "I still live in Seattle, and I have no plans to leave." I laughed quietly at myself. I spent an entire day creating a story that never existed. "Then we both made the same mistake," Nathan answered. "I assumed you were tired after the wedding instead of realizing you had misunderstood the conversation." We both fell silent for a moment before he spoke again. "There is one more thing I wanted to tell you before anything else has the chance to interrupt." His voice became quieter but even more sincere. "When I asked whether normal had to mean goodbye, I was hoping your answer would eventually become no." My heart felt lighter than it had since leaving the vineyard. I smiled despite the fact that he could not see it through the phone. "Then my answer is no." Nathan laughed softly, and I could almost picture the relieved expression on his face. "Good," he said, "because I never bought a ticket back to Seattle after Chicago. I rented a car instead." "Why?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Because tomorrow evening I will be in Portland," he replied. "I found the same independent bookstore where I first saw you 4 years ago. I thought perhaps we could begin our first real chapter exactly where this story quietly started." The following evening I arrived at the little independent bookstore a few minutes earlier than we had planned. Yet Nathan was already there standing near the same reading corner where our story had quietly begun 4 years before. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall front windows, filling the shop with a warm golden glow that made every shelf and every old wooden table feel comfortingly familiar. He looked up the moment I stepped inside, and the smile that crossed his face carried none of the hesitation that had defined our first conversations at the wedding. It was calm, genuine, and filled with quiet certainty. "I was hoping you would still like this place," he said. I laughed softly. I never stopped liking it. We spent hours wandering through the aisles without any schedule to follow, and without a single wedding responsibility waiting for either of us. We recommended favorite novels to one another, debated which classic stories deserved another reread, and shared coffee from the small cafe tucked into the corner where Nathan had first noticed me years earlier. For the first time, every conversation belonged entirely to us instead of being borrowed from someone else's celebration. Over the months that followed, the drive between Portland and Seattle slowly became part of our routine instead of an obstacle. Some weekends Nathan came south carrying new books he thought I would enjoy. Other weekends I drove north and explored the historic neighborhoods he loved restoring through his architectural work. We learned that lasting relationships were built less from dramatic moments than from ordinary ones shared consistently. Grocery shopping together, rainy Saturday mornings with coffee, afternoon walks through public gardens, and quiet evenings discussing books became the memories we treasured most. Emma often joked that her wedding had accomplished far more than bringing two families together. Whenever she teased Nathan about being the most successful best man in wedding history, he simply laughed and admitted that volunteering for one weekend had unexpectedly changed the direction of his entire life. Nearly a year later, another invitation arrived in the mail. One of Nathan's closest friends was getting married, and this time we attended together. As we walked toward the ceremony hand in hand, I suddenly remembered the first wedding where I had wondered why one thoughtful stranger kept looking in my direction. Nathan caught my smile and gently asked what I was thinking about. "I was remembering the first time I noticed you watching me," I admitted. He laughed quietly. "I was trying very hard not to make it obvious." You were not very successful. Apparently not. We both laughed before taking our seats among the guests. During the ceremony, the bride and groom exchanged rings while everyone watched the joyful moment unfold. Almost without thinking, I turned toward Nathan at exactly the same time he turned toward me. This time there was no uncertainty hidden behind the glance, no unanswered questions, and no fear that the moment would quietly disappear once the celebration ended. We simply smiled because neither of us needed to wonder what the other was thinking anymore. Later that evening, the photographer invited couples onto the dance floor for one final picture beneath glowing string lights. Nathan reached for my hand with the same quiet confidence that had always made me feel safe. As the camera captured the moment, I realized the happiest endings rarely arrive because of perfect timing. Sometimes they begin with an ordinary act of kindness inside a bookstore, continue through unexpected conversations at a wedding, survive a misunderstanding or two, and finally become something lasting because two people choose honesty over hesitation. Looking into Nathan's eyes beneath the warm evening lights, I understood that the most meaningful love stories are not the ones where two strangers meet by chance. They are the ones where life patiently gives two kind hearts every opportunity to recognize each other when the moment is finally right.